Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, Homemaker-in-Progress. And I thought, what better way than to talk about my birth story? So, my daughter is not a baby anymore, but I think birth stories are fun and I really enjoy listening to them. So, I hope you enjoy listening to my daughter's birth story. So, I originally was starting out with an OB and I ended up watching this TED Talk video and it was talking about having a natural delivery. And I was like, this sounds cool. So, I started looking into midwives and I ended up going with the midwife a little bit out of town, and they had like a team of midwives, so you didn't really know who you were going to deliver with. So that's kind of similar to when you're in the hospital setting. But I had a midwife that I really wanted to have at my delivery, and like at the very end of it, God worked it out so that she was the midwife that delivered, which was awesome. And so I'm just going to go through my pregnancy and my birth story and just what all happened there. So my pregnancy was relatively easy. I did have some complications. I wouldn't say anything really super serious, but I was around my 20 weeks. I found out that I had a low lying placenta. So that's different than placenta previa because it didn't actually cover my cervix, but it was just low lying. And the midwives that I was going with had specific requirements. So you had to be low risk. And basically, if you were too low lying placenta, then you could not deliver with the midwives. And so that was a little bit of a concern for me. But they're like, yeah, it usually moves. So we'll check again later. And praise God, it did move. And so it worked out. So that was taken care of great. Then when I was about 33 and a half weeks, I found out that my daughter was breech. You go to a hospital and you'd probably have to have a C-section. And I really didn't want to have a C-section because this was my first. And so I was pretty determined not to do that. So I was going to the chiropractor multiple times a week. I was also laying on an ironing board upside down on my couch to try to get her to flip. And I went to a chiropractic appointment, and the chiropractor was like, I think she's head down. So I went to the midwife and they checked, and she was more or less head down. Her head was in my hip, so she was a little bit off center. And so that she stayed, which was great. So then, that was taken care of, and I was moving forward with having my delivery with the midwife. And I had planned to be in a birth center. So I got to 39 weeks and I was super, super uncomfortable. So this is kind of a story that I like to tell because I don't really think that it's entirely at fault. But the Saturday before I went into labor, I was like, I'm going to do all this baking. I was close to my due date. And I think moms who are close to their due date know you're just like, I just want to have this baby and be done with this pregnancy. You're uncomfortable and you're big and you're so just ready to be done. And so I had pretty much gotten to that point. So I was like, I'm going to do all this baking. I actually did not do a ton of baking that day, but the one thing I did make was a coffee cake. So a coffee cake, you got the crumble on top, and I burnt it. Well, I had left it in the oven, and the timer's going off. I was on my couch. I run to the oven, which is a bad idea, and I hurt like bad. Wasn't having contractions at this point, but I had pubic symphysis, and so I was like in so much pain at the very end. And then the next day, I had a headache. I just was not feeling good. So we decided to go to the midwife and just make sure everything was okay. And the midwife was like, checked me. She was like, you're like 1 centimeter. I was a first time mom, so she wasn't really even expecting that. She gave me a membrane sweep and was like, basically, if this works, you go into labor in 48 hours. If it doesn't, whatever happens. So I left there, and then Monday, during the day, I started having contractions. They were really, really spread out and pretty mild at that point. I'm having contractions, and the day before, the midwife had suggested that we go to a chiropractor, and I went on Monday. And so when I called them, I'm like, hey, I'm due Thursday. Like, can I get in like ASAP? So they got me in Monday, and they adjusted it was tight, and so she was having me do some stuff, and it hurt, but I think it really helped. And so that night, it's like 10 o'clock, and I'm having regular contractions at this point. They're probably about every 7 minutes or so. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. Like, I'm in labor. Um, like, this is really happening. I actually pretty much stayed awake all night, and my contractions actually got pretty close together. At one point, I think they were about 3 minutes together, but they were really mild in the grand scheme of things. And so they really weren't anything probably to be concerned about. But because they were so close, I was like, I don't know what's happening. So I called the midwife, and the midwife was like, I don't think you're ready yet. Go take a shower, go back to sleep. So I did. Went, took a shower, tried to go back to sleep. And when I was laying down, it just felt like the contractions were way more painful. And so I was still in early labor. I can say that now, still very early labor. But at the time, I was like, I just cannot lay down. So I ended up getting up. I had probably only really slept, if you can even call it that, probably like an hour that night. So not very much. And looking back at it, I'm like, you should try to sleep as much as you can in that early labor because you don't know how long your labor is going to go and you can get really tired. Thankfully, my experience really wasn't like that, but pretty much after I got up, my contractions, I say stopped, but they didn't really stop. They were just really, really spread out. 20 minutes apart, 9 minutes apart, 11 minutes apart. There wasn't really a great consistency of like they're 5 minutes apart every so often, lasting for this long, but they could be sometimes pretty intense. So kind of just doing whatever in the morning. Did curb walking. It's trying to like, if you don't know what curb walking is, you basically walk with one foot on the curb and one foot on the bottom, just on the road, and you just walk back and forth, trying to kind of throw your hips out so the baby comes down. And I did that twice. And I started having some contractions. So I got up around like 6, and by noon, they started to get regular, more intense, and I was using a birth ball. We borrowed a birth ball from a lady from our church, and I was just rolling on that thing. I sat on it and I was just rotating myself. I don't know if that helped necessarily, but I started to really have some intense contractions. Like they were radiating into my thighs, and I was like, okay, these are intense. And at that point, they were probably 5 to 6 minutes apart, pretty consistently and pretty intense. And so I called the midwife, and the midwife was like, no, you're not ready. Maybe by tonight you'll be in here, but not yet. And so I called the midwife probably around 1:30 or so. And at some point, I was doing my rotating on the ball, and I just felt like instinctually I had to get down on my hands and knees. And I did. And then my water broke, and it broke like it popped. Some people were like, oh, yeah, mine just started leaking. No, mine like popped, like you could tell that that was what was happening. And at that point, the contractions became super, super intense. And even calls the midwife and it's like, hey, her water broke. And the midwife was like, okay, so let's get to this birth center, but like, don't rush. It's okay. Like, let's plan to meet in an hour. And so the birth center was about 45 minutes from where we lived. So you're going to have to drive all. But what was funny is that my husband was giving information to my mom and my mother-in-law, being like, hey, this is what's happening. And so he told my mom that my water broke. And my mom was like, well, tell her that the contractions get really hard at this point, which I had already found out because the contractions were really, really intense. And I was like, okay. So we finally get in the car. We're going on our way. And at this point, so I transitioned in the car. I was sitting there and I became super internal. I'd been pretty quiet throughout my labor in general, very low, if I was moaning or groaning or any of that kind of stuff, but like not yelling, not screaming, not in super like high pitched or anything like that. And even in the car ride, I became super internalized. Like I was not talking. And if you know me, that's pretty unusual. So I was just really, really quiet. And my husband is like, oh, look at the beautiful trees. So our daughter was born in the fall. So it's, the colors and it's beautiful. It was just really internalized at that point. And at the birth center, I started to feel pressure, like ready to push. So at that point, because we had taken a birth education class, I knew I was pretty close. Like I knew that I had to be at least probably 7 centimeters, if not more. So we get to the birth center, and I had to stop when I was walking from the car into the birth center, which was not very far, at least once for a contraction, like bent over, like stopped. Um, get in, and the midwife checks me, and I'm 9 centimeters. And the midwife, I think, was pretty surprised because I was a first time mom and I hadn't really been in official, like complete active labor for very long at all. At this point, I had been in active labor probably for about 3 hours. And from the time that my water broke to the time that my daughter was born was about just under an hour and a half. So it went really fast once my water broke. And my active labor, we consider it to be about 3.5 hours. I started to feel pressure, so I started pushing at that point. And she was born super quick. I don't even know how many times I pushed, but she was out really fast. And at this point, when I was pushing, I did get really, really loud. Like I was like yelling. And I feel like that was pretty instinctual. I just did it. And there was a point where the midwife was like, I can't find a heartbeat, but it's probably because she's so low. And I don't remember that really bothering me in the moment, but like looking back at it, I'm like, that probably was not a good thing. And I think the midwives at that point wanted to get her out. Um, but the reality is that the midwives were so great and so calm, just like really chill about it. I wasn't even worried about it. But I'm just so thankful. Everything was fine. She was born and got to have her on me. She was crying like crazy. And it was just like this huge moment of relief, like instant relief. She's here, it's over, and that was great. So my birth story overall was like fabulous. Like this was just pretty much an ideal situation for a first time mom.